Jesus' ministry on this earth was the greatest ministry of all time. He preached the word of God, healed the sick, did many miracles, and most of all, he loved the whole world. And at the end of his ministry, he proved his love towards us, towards you and me, by dying on the cross. So we see that this certainly is the greatest ministry of all time. But have you ever wondered, how did this great ministry ever begin? Well, stick around because in this video, we are going to look at the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry. This event takes place in a small village called Cana in Galilee, which is in Israel. Now, in this small village, there's a wedding that's taking place. So you can imagine, sort of put yourself in this situation. It's a small town, small village with not very many people. And so when there's a wedding, this is a very big event for such a small amount of people. So the wedding takes place, they're enjoying themselves, but then all of a sudden a dilemma comes up or an issue comes up. The hosts have run out of wine. Now, this may not seem like a very big issue, but in reality it is. Because in the Jewish culture, when a man was betrothed to another woman, he would spend his time preparing a house for them and proving that yes, he could take care of them. So, in the context of a wedding, if he's to run out of wine, it puts a very bad look on his family and his future family, because it makes it seem like perhaps he's not able to take care of his future bride. Now, at this wedding, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus himself and his disciples were there, because Cana was close to Nazareth, and if you know, Nazareth is the hometown of Jesus. So most likely he knew people that were there. Perhaps he even knew the bride and groom. So after the wine runs out, Mary knows this, and she goes up to Jesus and she says, "The wine has run out." And Jesus goes, he's like, "Woman, what is that to me? My hour has not yet come." And then his mother looks at the servants and she says, "Whatever Jesus tells you to do, you should go and do it." So Jesus agrees and he tells the servants, he says, "Look, there's some water pots over there. Go and fill them with water." So the servants, just like Mary said, go and they fill up the water pots all the way up to the brim with water. And Jesus says, "Okay, now go and take some out of the water pots in a pitcher and go and give it to the head waiter of the wedding." Now, this would be the guy who served all of the guests. He served them wine, served them food, etc. So the head waiter, he takes the stuff that the servants had brought him and he drinks it, and he's surprised because the water that was previously in the water jugs had now become wine. But the head waiter didn't know this. He did not see the miracle take place. Only the servants knew. Only the servants knew that Jesus had turned the water into wine. So the head waiter calls the bridegroom, right? The one who's getting married. And he calls him and he says, "Most people at their wedding serve the very best wine first. And then after people have drunk a little bit, then they serve the lesser wine or the not as good wine. But you, my friend, you have served the very best wine last." What an incredible record of the very first time Jesus performed a public miracle, thus starting off his public ministry. So that was just an overview of the text. Let's go back and dive into it. This is John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. So the first part I want to look at is in verses 3 and 4. It says, "When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come.'" Now, at first glance, or at first reading, the word woman might seem kind of strange to you. Like, who goes up to someone and say, woman? In our modern day and in our modern English, this may seem kind of rude, especially when talking to your own mother. Imagine, right? Imagine going up to your own mother and saying, woman. But I want you to understand the context and the cultural context of this statement. Now, as you know, the Gospel of John was written in Greek, but this is a Hebraic expression, meaning that this Greek came from Hebrew. It was translated over from Hebrew. And this word woman is used as a term of respect or as a term of endearment. Perhaps the modern English equivalent would be like madam or ma'am. And then Jesus says, what does this have to do with us? Now in Greek, this is written ti emoi kai soi, literally meaning what to me and to you. Now that doesn't really make sense in our modern English. And again, it's a Hebraic expression. And really what it means is Jesus is asking his mother, what does this have to do with me? It's none of my business. And then Jesus follows this up and he says, my hour has not yet come. What did Jesus mean by this? Now Jesus said this phrase, my hour has come, or my hour has not yet come, in several different places in the New Testament. So in order for us to figure out what this means, or what it could mean, let's look at some of the other different references that Jesus used this in. Mark chapter 14, verse 41. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough, the hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. John chapter 8, verse 20. These words he spoke in the treasury, as he taught in the temple, and no one seized him, because his hour had not yet come. John 12, verse 23. And Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. John 16, verse 21. Whenever a woman is in labor, she has pain, because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish, because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. Revelation 14, verse 7. And he said with a loud voice, fear God, and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven and the earth and sea and springs of water. So I hope from these verses you can see what this phrase means. It just means it is either a time for something to happen, or it is not yet a time for something to happen. So Jesus is saying here in verse 4 that it is not yet time for him to start doing miracles. Now moving on to verse 5, it says, his mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Now it seems like Mary just sort of ignored Jesus when he says, my hour is not yet come. And she goes and tells the servants that whatever Jesus tells you to do, you should go do it. But as mentioned before, this was a dire situation. And so Mary is asking her son, Jesus, she knows what he is able to do, and she's asking him to come and help out in this situation. So Jesus accepts, and he goes and he tells the servants to go and fill up the water jugs. Notice verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Now, what is this Jewish custom of purification that is mentioned here? Look at Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they cleanse themselves. And there are many other things which they have received in order to observe, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and copper pots. So this Jewish custom of purification is just that you need to wash yourself before going to eat. You need to wash all the pots and pans before using them, especially in a public setting. Now this is similar also to some of our cultures as well, where we wash our hands before eating. And like, we don't use dirty plates when going to put food on them for us to eat. So it's sort of similar to that. So Jesus tells the servants to go and fill up these water pots all the way up to the brim with water. And so the servants go and do this. And then Jesus tells them, he says, go now and take some out of the water pots that you just filled. Take some out and go and take it to the head waiter. So the servants now follow Jesus' directions and they go and do this. Now, notice verses 9 and 10. When the head waiter tasted the water which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. So now here is the mention that the water had become wine. Here's the mention of the actual miracle that Jesus did. Now it mentions that the head waiter did not know where this wine had come from, but the servants knew because they were actually the eyewitnesses of Jesus' miracle. They themselves had put the water into the water pots, and they themselves took the water and gave it to the head waiter. And yet, when they took the water out, it had become wine, and the head waiter even tasted it and said, this is the best wine ever. So the head waiter called the bridegroom to himself and congratulated him. And he says, most people serve the good wine first, or the best wine first, and then after people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. See, people at weddings would usually serve the best wine first, so that when people are fresh in the wedding, they've just come and then they taste this good wine, it leaves a good impression on the bridegroom and the host. But then after the wedding has been going on for a while, and the guests have been drinking some of the good wine, then after that runs out, then they serve the poorer wine. And perhaps the thought is that the guests might not know much of a difference. And I think it was just a money-saving tactic, to be honest. Now, when the bridegroom gets called over to the head waiter and gets told that this wine that he gave to the people at the very end is the best wine ever, I'm sure he's like, what are you talking about? Because notice, the bridegroom didn't know. It was only the servants and Mary and Jesus who had heard about this miracle. But I'm sure that the servants and probably Mary also went and told people about it and told his disciples. And that's how it's recorded down in the Gospel of John. But I'd like you to get this point. The point is that Jesus did not serve any random wine. He served the best wine. Just another example of how Jesus does it better. I mean, he is the Son of God. Of course he can make the very best wine. And he does that, and he proves that yet again. And he does make the very best wine. And he shows for the very first time to the public that he can do these miracles. And that he's good at doing these miracles. So here we come to the very last verse of this section, verse 11. This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Notice the phrase, this beginning of his signs. The miracles that Jesus did were signs for the Jewish people. Signs to show that he had come from God. Signs that manifested his glory. And signs to tell the people who he was. Just for an example, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 23 to 27, it's the event where Jesus calms the storm, right? Him and his disciples are on the sea, and there's a big storm, right? The wind is blowing against them, the waves are beating against the ship, and the disciples are scared. Yet Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, and all becomes perfectly still. But notice the reaction that the disciples give. They say, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? See, they noticed who Jesus was because of his miracles. Who can calm the waves and the wind like that? Who is this guy? So it was in fact a sign that Jesus was the Son of God and that he had come from God. Also notice John chapter 5 verse 36. But the testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John. For the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do, testify about me that the Father has sent me. See, the works that Jesus did, these testified about him. Who can do these works that this guy does? They pointed to the fact that he was God. Now, we've seen that Jesus can do all of these miracles, right? We've seen the very first miracle that Jesus did. And at first glance, it could seem like it's a magic trick. But notice this, Jesus never did miracles for the sake of putting on a show. Jesus was not a magician. He was the Son of God, and he had a purpose to fulfill on this earth. These signs were for the Jewish people. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 22. For indeed Jews ask for signs, and Greeks search for wisdom. So Jews want to see these signs, and Jesus is giving them these signs that he is the Messiah, that he is God. Now, unfortunately, even though the Jews were given these signs, yet still many of them did not believe. So what was the result of these signs that Jesus did? Again in verse 11, they manifested the glory of Jesus, and they manifested the glory of God, because who else can do these things? Only God. And then it mentions that the disciples also believed in him. They were seeing these signs, and I'm sure they saw this very first sign that Jesus did. Or at least they heard about it from the servants who were serving the wine at the wedding. But here again we see the purpose of the Gospel of John. In John chapter 20, verse 31, these have been written so that you may believe, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That is the purpose of Jesus doing these miracles, to show people that he is God and to get them to believe in him so that they may have life in Jesus' name. So how do we apply this? How do we apply this event of Jesus' first miracle to our own lives? Well, if we have read the scriptures, we have read about Jesus' miracles. Or if we've been told about his miracles, we've heard them, right? In light of these miracles, what is our response to him? He has shown us his signs, and we have heard about his miracles. But do we believe? Have we seen that only God can do these things? Now, in the Old Testament, there were prophets who used to do this. But in this case, the prophets gave all the glory from the miracles to God. With Jesus, all the glory went to himself, and rightfully so, because he is God. So whenever we as Christians, as believers in Jesus, whenever maybe we do some teaching or some preaching or sharing the gospel or whatever we do for Jesus, whatever we do in our Christian life, all that glory that maybe would go to us must go to the Lord Jesus Christ, because in reality he is the only one worthy of such praise and such glory. You and I are nothing. We are just tools for his glory, and that's a beautiful thing. We must make sure that all glory and all praise goes to God and God alone. Now, there's also something I would like to point out. In this world, there are three groups of people. The first group of people are like the disciples in verse 11. They saw the miracles and they believed in Jesus. The second group of people we see in John chapter 12, verse 37. But though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing in him. This group of people have seen the miracles of Jesus, have seen his signs. Or in today's day and age, we have heard the gospel. They have heard about the gospel. They have heard that Jesus rose from the dead and perhaps they've even heard of what he did in his life, his many miracles, and yet they still do not believe in him. Now, the third group of people we see in chapter 12, verse 42 and 43. Nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. This third group of people is about people who have believed in Jesus, but they're scared to share about him. In fact, they're ashamed of him. Perhaps people will make fun of them. Perhaps even they would be persecuted and beaten for the sake of Christ. If they were to share that they were a Christian, they might get beaten or even killed. But in less extreme circumstances, this is when people are scared of being made fun of or being, hey, look at that guy, he's a Christian. They love the approval of men rather than the approval of God. Which of those is more important? Which holds more weight? See, in this verse, the rulers believed in Jesus, yet they did not act on their belief because of the fear of man. So let me ask you this question. Which group are you in? We have all seen the evidence of Jesus' divinity. It's right here in the Holy Scriptures. We all have the record of his signs and miracles. But the question is, do you believe in him? If not, look at the overwhelming evidence that we have in the Scriptures of Jesus' power and of the miracles that he did and signs that show that he is God. If you look at these miracles, you can only conclude that Jesus is divine, that he came from God and that he is God. And if you do believe this already, do you share him with others? Or are you scared that people will make fun of you? Do you love the approval of men rather than the approval of God? Do not be ashamed of the gospel of Christ.